First of all, let's get real. Fire has been on this planet for the last 420 million years. How do we ever have forests if it's been always blazing for millions of years, right? Especially the native flora and fauna co-evolved with fire as serving important ecological function.
This episode is brought to you in part by our sponsor, Tidal Influence, a Californian ecological consulting firm who proudly supports environmental education and all of the diverse conservation efforts that Pelecanus works to highlight. Visit their website at tidalinfluence.com to learn more about what they do to conserve our coastal resources and how you can get involved. In this episode of Conservation Conversations, we are starting a new mini-series called Conservation on Fire. To kick things off, we have a living legend. We talk with Tim Inglasbee of FUSEE, Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. FUSEE educates and advocates for the use of safe and sound ecological fire management practices that promote ecosystem resilience, support cultural burn traditions, and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Now let's talk to Tim and hear all about it. Enjoy! Tim, thank you so much for joining us. Can you please introduce yourself, who you are, and what you do?
All right, thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. My name is Timothy Inglasbee. I'm Executive Director of Firefighters United for Safety, Ethics, and Ecology. Our acronym is FUSEE, and those are the handheld torches that firefighters carry around in their packs to light control burns, either for restoration purposes or even for safety purposes during wildland fires. We like to think of ourselves as torchbearers for a new fire management paradigm.
I like that. I see the Firehawk behind you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Frida Firehawk.
Ah, Frida? Is that what you said?
Frida Firehawk. Yes.
Ah, nice.
Pun intended.
Yeah.
But that's actually inspired by an Australian kite, a kind of hawk that is also a fire-bearing, tool. Carries fire, burning little branches, drops it in the meadows to flush out its prey. And so humans are not the only creatures that use fire as a tool.
You mentioned FUSEE, your organization. What is it? What are you guys doing at FUSEE? Because I understand the acronym there, but like, what kind of projects? What is your overall mission? Just tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, we engage in public education and policy advocacy, promoting safe, ethical, ecological fire management. And there's a lot to unpack there, but we were born out of these fire science and management conferences that are held every year or once or twice a year, and they can bring in hundreds of people, a lot of them federal employees and academics, and they come from all over the world, but particularly here in the United States, there was just a lot of frustration, cognitive dissonance, if you will. What we're learning in fire ecology science is going in one direction. What we're actually doing in fire management, the opposite direction. We know that most forest ecosystems are fire adapted, many of them fire dependent, and they need more fire. We've had this really historic fire deficit from decades of fire exclusion and fire suppression policies. And, that's what our science is telling us. That's what it seems the reality is showing us. Each fire we put out, we're merely putting off the next bigger, hotter blaze, right? But we're still aggressively attacking over 96% of all wildfire conditions, regardless of their source, location, conditions, or actual effects. So all this cognitive dissonance amongst all these fire professionals, particularly amongst the federal agency employees who are very frustrated because they really have no voice. They are, particularly Forest Service, they are prohibited from speaking out to reporters, speaking out to legislators or anyone, outside, explicit authorization from their, public affairs officers or whatever. They needed a voice to engage in education and advocacy. And so we said, well, let's form an organization. So that's what happened. A nonprofit organization. This is actually our 20th anniversary, and we are a very small grassroots organization. Members spread all across the country, from Alaska to Florida and Hawaii and Maine. But we kind of have a regional focus in the West, but we're having a national impact in policy debates and particularly in the news media. Because particularly with our wildland firefighters, is kind of a unique messenger to convey the message that conventional firefighting as we know it has huge risks, soaring costs, and increasing impacts that are not sustainable. And this whole war on wildfire paradigm must end. In fact, it will end one way or the other. But in fact, the Forest Service hired a panel of futurists. These are not fortune tellers. These are actual scientists studying trends and working with wildland fire experts. And they've said, yeah, this war on wildfire paradigm will end sooner or later. It's almost inevitable. And they charted out 3 possible scenarios. One is system collapse. I mean, we just, the climate crisis exceeds, goes wildly out of control. Peak oil, prevents us from engaging in these, heavy metal air shows and dozers and engines and all that. And it just ends. It kind of, catastrophic, or a kind of slow decline from business as usual. And we just keep racking up more pollution, resource depletion, economic, inflation or whatever. And so eventually we're just not able to sustain the costs or the environmental impacts of conventional suppression. The third scenario is the one that inspires us. And they called it an enlightened paradigm shift, in which we embrace working with fire and living with fire as native peoples on this continent did since time immemorial. And it's always a good question I pose to people here at public events. How was it that where I live in Western Oregon in the Willamette Valley, that was the ancestral lands of the Kalapuli Indians? How was it that the Kalapuli Indians lived in a fire-prone environment and they didn't own a single air tanker, a single dozer, or a single fire engine? How did they survive? Well, Native peoples didn't fight fires. They would light fires. And that is how they lived in a fire-prone environment. By working with fire, it enabled them to just not live, but thrive with fire. So that's how FUSEE was born, from that kind of community and our desire to get this alternative perspective out. And we found that particularly wildland firefighters and increasingly now indigenous fire practitioners are very persuasive, compelling voices on the need for real change.
So I really like you guys' organization because, I was actually just at a fire symposium this week in Central California, and we were kind of talking about it afterwards. There still seem to be, in a lot of fields, but especially in this field, there seems to be a really big disconnect between the academic world and the practitioners. And the academics are saying this thing, and the practitioners are saying, yeah, we've been doing that for 30 years. And you're like, well, now we have papers that show that you're right. It's like, oh, great, I guess, thanks, or the other way around. Yeah. So I really like that you guys are trying to link those two worlds.
Yeah.
And I guess to kind of take a step back, and you kind of said there's a bit of a disconnect there, but I guess my first question when it comes to that is, how specifically, I guess it depends on the habitat, but how can fire be good for the landscape? In what ways is it good?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's get real. Fire has been on this planet for the last 420 million years. How do we ever have forests if
Yeah.
it's been always blazing for millions of years, right? Especially the native flora and fauna co-evolved with fire as serving an important ecological function. And and particularly in the North American continent, this fire can come from many different sources. Lightning bolts, very volcanic eruptions, rock falls that strike. But native peoples in particular provided a very vital source of ignition that was very intentional. Specific places, specific purposes, and points in time that over hundreds of generations of steward the land with fire, the native flora and fauna kind of co-evolved with indigenous burning as well. And so what we get in the news media is all the horror stories of fire as an agent of death and destruction and disaster, and that's just the way the news media works, with kind of sensationalism. If it bleeds, it leads, and if it burns, it earns, right? But it's one thing to take film after a fresh fire, and you see blackened trunks and denuded slopes. Rarely do they venture out there the next spring when the green up is happening, when perhaps some of those trees are fleshing out, new foliage, when all the woodpeckers are coming in, and all the, it's fire is just part of that cycle of life and death, emerging to life and death. And it really serves multiple functions. Number one, especially dry, like forests, where much of the interior West is kind of arid, semi-arid. Well, there's just not enough moisture to help decay processes. So fire is one of nature's recyclers. It turns some of those dead down limbs and needles and logs, turns it into soil nutrients to help feed new plants. Some species, they only regenerate with the heat effects of fire, the smoke or the flames itself. Some lodgepole pine species, their cones are just sealed tight with a very waxy resin. The heat opens those cones, releases those seeds. The giant sequoia can't really, the seeds can't sprout in, without cleared soil and open, sunshine. That's a remarkable species, very fire dependent. The biggest tree species on the planet, and its seeds are just microscopic. And fire serves as kind of a stimulus, an ecological stimulus. In fact, I prefer that term over natural disturbance, because it's still kind of disturbing, and it's an ecological stimulus, and it just kind of rejuvenates habitats, makes this kind of shifting mosaic on the land of early cereal, mid cereal, late cereal patches, and forms just a lot of edges that actually enhances the richness of biodiversity. A lot of different species can occupy these different shifting stages of succession, and fire is just a really important agent in cycling and rejuvenating habitats. So that's how it functions ecologically. But as native people learned and knew, it also has many social benefits too, particularly in what they would steward resources of various foods or fibers or medicines that we're often, fire dependent, fire adapted species that actually enhance their biological productivity and their quality. So many benefits news media rarely ever covers. They might do a story on fire ecology in the depths of wintry February, but when it comes to July, August, November, and there's wildfires land, it's all disaster all the time.
The safety, ethics, and ecology part of FUSEE. So how do those tenets shape what you do? Like how does it that how do you take that that cool acronym into action?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we're inspired by the symbol, the triangle, the fire combustion triangle.
Yeah.
Very famous. Any fire needs heat, oxygen, and fuel to burn. That's the three legs of the triangle. Pull one of those legs off, and combustion is no longer able to be sustained. The fire will go out. So that's what we feel about safety, ethics, and ecology. They're part of an integrated system. If you pull one of those legs out, the system will collapse. So, for example, I mean, there's been kind of a real revolution in culture uh, highlighting firefighter safety, and that's during actual, wildfire responses. That is great. But if you're trying to do, provide for firefighter safety by like leveling the forest, okay, these clear cut fuel breaks that look like power line paths that are just devoid of, that's making it more dangerous for everything else living in the forest at the expense of, firefighters. The system will collapse and it actually won't work. You strip off trees and usually something more flammable, takes over that space. Likewise, in terms of ethics, if you're just shoveling out money to these contractors, like in particular air tanker contractors, the large air tanker has just one single use, one single mission. Drop the red stuff on the yellow stuff, and it's hugely expensive and very minimally effective. Mostly in the times, place, conditions it's used. What could one slurry load from one large air tanker buy in terms of boots on the ground? Who can do a lot of different things, not just fight fires, but manage fires, build trails, cut, pile, burn, lots of things that boots on the ground, actual labor can do as opposed to these capital intensive, heavy metal, private contractors that are operating under the profit motives, not necessarily public service motives. So ethics is a big issue. And so we kind of promote both environmental ethics and professional ethics too. And in particular, you instill in fire crews this sense of being land stewards, not just suppression soldiers, obey orders, from above without question. Land stewards, I mean, it really, pumps them up for the most part. And then last thing is ecology. I mean, if anything is not ecologically sustainable, the system's going to crash. So that's the FUSEE triad of safety, ethics, and ecology. Safety is number one. Safety for firefighters, safety for communities, safety for the land. So safety is number one. Ethics is at the heart of our mission, both professional and environmental ethics. But ecology is the bottom line. And if you pull one of those legs off, the system collapses. So that's kind of what powers our mission here, that sense of a holistic integration.
I love that. I love the use of the combustion triangle too. That was perfect. And that was actually going to be my next question was how have you seen the fire culture change? Because, like I said, about 10 years for me. And even in the last 10 years, like I'm seeing some things I'm like, wow, I would have killed for that when I started 10 years ago. and some of our projects that I'm doing professionally, it's all about changing that culture and setting up, in a different way, but specifically in Southern California. But, you have a lot more history with fire than I do. So since you started, and maybe even more recently, how have you seen it change? And I know that's kind of your goal, is to change it, but how have you seen it change over those decades?
Well, when I started, I mean, there's the 10 and 18 standard, firefighting orders, and watch out, because too many to remember, especially in the heat of the moment, right? But the number one credo was fight fire aggressively, but provide for safety if you can. And so, operating on that as a 20-something who didn't know anything, you're just following the leaders. I mean, I participate in a lot of dumb, dangerous, probably illegal things in Uncle Sam's firefighting army. And, had my own share of near misses and whatever, and, still have like recurring nightmares of, crewmates getting savagely injured, and, dropping a flaming snag that was falling down, just waited, be patient, and let nature do its thing. So, aggressive fire suppression, and just that whole militaristic mentality of fighting fires, and initial attack and extended attack. I was a hell attack crew. It was all attack all the time, But then the South Canyon fire in 1994 on Storm King Mountain in Colorado wiped out like 14 firefighters. That year, in fact, 1994, I think it was 34 wildland firefighters, the nation's elite, smoke jumpers, hot shots, hell attack, died in the line of duty. And that was just a shock. Shock to everybody, the system. Another sign that we've kind of surpassed our human limits to this, control this force in nature. That led to the Federal Wildland Fire Management Policy in 1995, which really was a revolutionary document. It still is the foundational policy for federal agencies, but it's like being ghosted. It's like it never happened. It was, but the real top policy shift was firefighter safety, number one in all fire management actions. Now, so, the climate crisis has just cranked up since 94, 95. Really, the marker was 1987. I was on the siege of 87 in California and in Oregon. That's where we like, oh my God, climate change is real. Well, yeah, you meet very few climate change denialists on the fire lines these days. So,
right.
But yeah. Firefighter safety means maybe not aggressively rushing headstrong into head fires. It sometimes means backing off, sometimes way off, waiting for conditions that are, where you have some measure of success in your goals. And so, firefighter safety is the highest priority. It's just not worth it. Losing the life of a 20-year-old wildland firefighter to stop a wildfire from burning to the top of a mountain in a fire-dependent ecosystem, it's just not worth it anymore, if it ever was. And so, I think it took some time. Took some time to kind of chill out. A lot of firefighters are adrenaline junkies. We like to work hard. We like to, face certain risks. And let's be real, there are inherent risks and hazards, safety risk, health hazards in every fire situation. But we can make it much safer and that's been a big cultural shift internally. Sometimes it causes, like, the public doesn't understand. Why aren't you out fighting these fires? Why aren't you putting them out? Look at all this smoke we're having to endure for weeks. Just put it out. Well, it's not the same thing as a municipal firefighting situation where it's a single point of ignition. You just surround and drown it with endless water. It's not like that at all in a wildland fire situation. So I have to highlight safety. The trouble is, I do see, like, especially in Congress, members of Congress will wrap themselves in the flag of firefighter safety to promote these kind of spurious logging bills. That'll make it safe for firefighters. Level the forest. Big trees make big fire. Well, that's just a big lie, sort. Uh, what the real issue with climate change isn't so much these giant tsunamis of flame rolling across the landscape. It's doing that in places, absolutely. But it's mostly the small stuff. It's so tinder dry. Every little dead twig or needle or limb on the ground is ignitable from the tiniest ember. And so it's this rate of spread that's super fast, overwhelming the ability of the crews to get out there, anchor, flank, and hold, sweeping through communities before we can hardly evacuate. Before they even, it's just the rate of spread is extreme these days, forcing fire crews to back way off and engage in places where they have some chance of containing or steering or confining. Rivers, ridges, and roads are typically, the top three. So, and it's also forcing a shift in philosophy. This is what's powering us. Instead of reactively fighting against all fires, proactively managing the habitat for fire. And so that doesn't mean logging off the biggest trees because they're the biggest fuel pots. It's actually working, instead of the crown down, the ground up, working on those surface vegetation and fuels, and then the lower limbs and saplings and shrubs. And what happens when they're logging is they're taking out the least flammable portion of a tree, its big trunk, haul that away, dump the most flammable portion, all its needles and limbs, right on the ground where, it took a lightning bolt to get that tree on fire before. Now just a cigarette butt will do, when you cook through slash. That has been the history of our country. Fires follow the axe all across the continent, and these huge wastelands of stumps and slash, united by sparks from locomotives or whatever. It's just, and here we are. So working from this particular, that surface layer, fire has the most influence on wildfire, and so that's what we're trying to proactively reintroduce fire under the best of conditions for desirable ecological effects, safe management, instead of trying to fight against them in the worst conditions for that. So
I do want to talk about some of your programs at FUSEE, your projects. And so, everything you just kind of said, how the culture is changing, how you want it to change, you guys have implemented projects. So to start that, I'll just list out your burning issues on the website are climate change, community fire preparedness, ecological fire management, indigenous cultural burning, suppression impacts and costs, logging and fire, wildfire monitoring, and policy advocacy. And that's way more than the three parts of a triangle, but you can break out that three-part triangle, and
yes,
the next level are those 7 or 8 ideas. Yeah. So can you talk about some of your projects, programs, maybe including Fire Generation Collaborative, about how all those burning issues are I wouldn't say addressed, because you're not, not one organization is going to fix the problem, but like what you're working toward.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have a very active program of outreach and engagement with the news media, and particularly giving them tools to, improve their coverage of wildfire events. So it's not just war stories or catastrophes, So we do that because, by and large, what most people know about wildfire is what they read in the newspapers or see on the TV news. And that is very distorted, by and large. So we're trying to work with reporters to just kind of break them out of that hackneyed script, war on wildfire and, the catastrophe, And particularly, we want to highlight some very positive stories that are not getting reported about crews that are safely and ethically and ecologically managing fires. And that's a shame. If a wildfire burns in the middle of a wilderness area and no firefighters are sent to put it out, it doesn't make a sound. And if firefighters are there on a huge blaze and no homes are lost, and nobody is hurt or killed, that's a huge success story that rarely makes any news. So that's one of our big programs, and we're in the news a lot, mostly because we've got a different message than than the kind of body count of homes destroyed and acres burned and all that stuff. So that's one thing. Another program is we provide solidarity with Indigenous fire practitioners, helping them, elevate their voices, telling their stories about the multiple benefits of cultural burning. And so that's a big thing. Our vision of ecological fire management isn't just this kind of utopian fantasy of the future. It's really inspired by the legacy of Indigenous burning. There's a long legacy of that, of how to do that, and especially the intentionality, the purposes of that. So we work with Indigenous fire practitioners to help get them in the news media, and then we have this kind of resurgence of interest in our message from young firefighters and young fire students. So one of our programs is the Fire Generation Collaborative, and they are really trying to reimagine and transform fire culture, both within the fire community and within society at large, and they're trying to reimagine what's called wildfire governance. Who gets decision-making powers in terms of fire projects and programs and wildfire things? And their vision is more equitable solutions to the wildfire crisis, particularly by centering Indigenous leadership, as a kind of a known solution, and raising the voices of diverse young generations. And that's really important, because really, who is going to face the most burden from the climate crisis and all the increased wildfire activity for the longest duration of their lifetimes? It's the young generations. Who's going to be expected to do the work of responding to wildfires or recovering from wildfires? It's going to be young generations. Who has the least voice in any of the policies that we're formulating today? Young generations. So that's really where we started, is trying to get young people a seat at the table of these policy-making bodies and a voice in decision-making over how we're going to manage fire and fire-dependent landscapes and ecosystems. So Fire Generation Collaborative is just really inspiring a lot of young people with their hopeful vision that, yes, we have a future where we can survive and thrive. And it's going to take a lot of hard work. And as you know, Austin, this hard work of managing fire is best suited for young, strong bodies. So, and yeah, my needs are retired from that. But so they just got just exuberant, youthful, hopeful energy, and I've gone with Fire Gen to Washington D.C., and the chief of the Forest Service met with us privately, personally, an hour and a half. Very receptive, because what's happening is agencies like the Forest Service are having a huge crisis. They are not recruiting enough firefighters. The occupation is no longer appealing to the young generation because it's not sustainable. The pay is miserable. It always was, but now everything costs more, and the pay is miserable. There's minimal benefits. The hazards and risks are increasing, and so and the culture is, it's long been privileging kind of white male jocks, straight white male jocks, and younger generation is far more diverse and far more so. So FireGen has a really great message about, but it's going to take more than a boost in pay and benefits. I can't see a mental health counselor once a month to really try. We got to change the mission, because young people are not keen on just jumping on that treadmill of endless suppression, going nowhere. They really want to be part of the solution. They want to help steward the land and help be part of that, of climate recovery.
Yeah. So, what was it that got you interested in, well, I guess fire, but then also making that switch or that shift over to the safety, ethics, and ecology part of fire? What was it? What was it for you? That were you just a firefighter and you're like, I don't know if this is the right way to do this, or how did that all work for you?
Well, I mean, I didn't know anything about fire till I was 20 years young and got hired by the Forest Service to come and fight fire. So I moved out west. My only experience was I had a work study job at my college back east, making outdoor ice skating rinks with fire hoses. So I knew how to screw two ends of a fire hose together. That was it. I guess I hope the standards have raised, in qualifications but I it was a marvelous experience. And when I was in my 20s, yeah, I lived in the back of my pickup, and it was terrible pay, but it was endless hours. They didn't give us R&R. I'd be barnstorming the West all summer long, and fighting fire aggressively. I was on some of the smokiest fires ever recorded. It definitely impacted my condition years later. It was just, but I could, in one summer, I could take fire checks and pay for a whole year of college tuition. That's not possible with young people these days. I had a nice home to come back to, and they don't these days. A few experiences, again, of doing dumb, dangerous, probably blatantly illegal activities under orders. It was counterproductive. It bothered my conscience. And then when I would go to school in the winters, I was learning everything I could about fire ecology, fire policy, and realized, wow, I was all swelled up with this fantasy that I was, defending the forest through aggressive firefighting. Just the opposite. It came to a point that I was just really disturbed with cognitive dissonance. And then came my assignment, being a resource advisor for 6 hotshot crews descending upon our national park. And I found, first of all, I was attached to the crew. Attached to a hotshot crew I'd actually worked with years earlier. So I was out there, mopping up along with them and all that. But they really went to heroic lengths to limit their impacts, to protect the resources at risk, and kind of loose herd the fire instead of just stomp on it. And it was inspiring. It was kind of epiphany. It was an epiphany. This is how we should be managing fire in wildlands, working with it to help maximize its ecological benefits while minimizing the risk to firefighters, the cost to taxpayers, the impacts to the land. And that experience stuck with me. In the meantime, I was a conservationist, using my knowledge of fire management, fire ecology, to help, oppose all these spurious logging bills that were coming out of Congress. Going to all these conferences in which just the community, the wildland fire community, was grieving from being forced to do just the opposite things of what were really understood needed to be happening. So that's kind of the origin story and my personal story. And so I up until just last year, I got an injury in my kung fu sparring. I snapped my Achilles tendon. That so I lost my red card. So, but up until then, I've been certified every year and took the pack tests and all that. Could go out and prescribe burns. But now I realize is just where I'm at in age and ability. My role is here in an office, providing for those crews on the front lines. And my real hope is that the young generation doesn't have to follow my same path of this warrior against wildfire and just suck it up with miserable pay and conditions and health impacts you'll feel later in life, uh, and can really engage in that occupation as a land steward with fire instead of just some kind of foot soldier of suppression. So that's what's kind of keeping me out of here.
Foot soldier of suppression. I like that term. And one of the questions that we ask everybody is about hope and optimism, and we call it possibilism, just based off of the Michael Soule quote, wherein if you have everything you need, you have resources and attitude, and you can, if the changes are possible, if you just make it a priority. And so our question is always kind of like, so what is it that gives you hope? How is it that sometimes it's difficult and you wake up and you're like, I don't want to do this today. But as you kind of mentioned, you're a leader of a lot of younger generation people in your organization. So what is it that gives you hope to keep doing this and to grow your program and to make the changes that you think are necessary in the fire world?
That's a great question, and I don't know. It might be something about my personality, my stubborn Dutch heritage. I am defiantly hopeful. Okay, because our society seems to be pervasive with cynicism and despair and hopelessness and dark times we may be in, but the tiniest light, especially if fire can grow. And what makes me hopeful is because I actually have had these experiences. I was also a restoration crew leader, and I've seen even to this day, decades later, I go back and the rock walls and soil and native plants I helped put in this scarred land, they're there and growing. I have seen where human hands can really nurture life and vitality. We're not just this parasitic, species that are just plundering the planet and destroying it. Yes, that's happening, absolutely. But there's also many caregivers and doing whatever they can, wherever they can. And I draw inspiration from the helpers. And I also understand that there's this other story of fire. Yes, some carbon goes up in the sky. A lot of carbon stays on the ground as charcoal. And the half-life of like biochar is 1,000 years, way past the lifespans of most trees. That is really reversing what we're exhuming, dead carbon from the lithosphere, spewing in the sky. When fire chars wood, it delays decay. It's pulling it back out of the sky, sinking in the ground, doing wonderful things. There's this whole other story of fire. Fire typically does. I mean, fire will consume the little stuff, but it'll save the big stuff, which is opposite from logging. It takes the big trees and leaves behind the little trees. And so I have hope in that if we, Native peoples survived prolonged periods of climate variability, droughts and heat waves, and they did it, by working with fire in ways that did it. So Yes, I'm full of hope, at times tested, but you know, the thing, what I feel is, is we need hope most when it feels hopeless. And that's when we need it the most. And you can't lose it, because then it is hopeless. So I guess I'm a refusenik to succumb to, despair and cynicism and fatalism. I'm against doomism, absolutely. And so, and just the element of fire is a symbol of it's a transformational force that is all about life, really. I mean, it comes from life. The oxygen of the planet came from life. The fuel it burns came from life. That's what I draw. I have, my hope is a little green fire burning in my heart, and it can't be snuffed out.
I like that, but I especially like the hope through stubbornness idea. Just like, no, I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to do what you want just because
Yeah.
it looks like it. So with that said, how can people, and maybe the younger generations, how can people get involved with FUSEE, whether they're in Oregon or around the world? Where how can they get involved?
Well, I'd say first check out our website, because it has a lot to it, including some kind of hopeful ideas. And that's our website, fusee.org. And then you can join our social media at FUSEE Fire, and then reach out to us through either of those platforms, and see what can happen. We are very small. Again, we're a small grassroots group. We're kind of regional focused, but we're having a national impact, I believe, because there's such a drought of these positive, hopeful avenues for people who want to change the story about fire. So I really welcome all to, help us change that story of fire.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was amazing. We are really inspired by the work that you are doing and FUSEE is doing and everyone involved. And I hope that people get involved and we can figure out a way to help each other in the future. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you again to Tim for talking all about what FUSEE is doing to create a better world in fire through all of the means they can. Please check out their website and get involved with them or wherever you can. Hosts are Austin and Taylor Parker. Producers are Austin and Taylor Parker. Music was provided by Picture Book Studios. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you want to help. We'll talk to you next time.